introduce our panelists and our moderator and then hand it over to them and get out of the way. Our moderator today is Dr. Soojung-Kim Pang. If you were here yesterday afternoon, you heard Alex and Joe O'Connor from 4-Day Week Global talk about redesigning time in our work lives, and that was a fabulous session. We'll provide that recording out later this week. He is going to be moderating this panel, and he is joined by Steve Chalgren, who is the VP and GM of the Specification program at Bluetooth. Vita Kwan, the co-founder and chief progress. Oh, Vita, your thing is wrong, and I don't know why. Vita is actually at Girlboss, which is super cool, amazing media platform. And I so apologize. Somehow our cut and paste did not get you correct, but I know Alex is going to have you introduce yourself anyways. But you're at Girlboss, who's one of my favorite current favorite media platforms ever. So check it out. And then Iwo Szapar, who is the CEO of Remote How, joining us most likely from Europe. So I'm going to go off screen and turn it over to Alex.
All right. Thank you very much, Heatherly. Thanks to all of you for coming to this session, and particularly to our speakers. I believe we've got one, I believe Steve is on his way. However, in the interest of time and the fact that unfortunately I have to be leaving a little bit early, we're going to go ahead and get things started. I thought that it would be good just to take a moment and give each of the panelists an opportunity to say, take a moment, explain who they are. The title of this panel is Getting Unstuck, How to Make Work Beyond Space and Time. It's, I think, something of a follow-on this morning, the previous. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time rehearsing the summary of it or whatever. Let's just get straight into who we're hearing from. So Vita, how about you go first? Tell us who you are, where you are, what you're doing. Good stuff like that, please.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Vita. I am one of the brand partnership managers at Girlboss, and I am based in Toronto, Canada. My role at Girlboss is really bring on partners that can help drive a lot of our editorial content that surrounds, women empowerment and navigating how to help women navigate the future of work. So, really excited about our company mission. And just for the panelists to know, I'm on my own journey of figuring out how work fits into my life. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone today. I'm sure, there's the brightest leaders on the panel today. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And I think we're all on our own journey, and maybe you can introduce yourself and say where you are and where you are on your journey about work.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Oh, sorry. I thought.
Oh no, sorry. This was.
Go ahead. Yes, my name is Iwo Szapar, and as Heatherly mentioned, I'm CEO at Remote How, but I prefer to go by a remote work advocate. This is what we've been doing at Remote How before remote work went mainstream. So we started Remote How in 2017, and ever since we helped over 400 companies worldwide make remote and now hybrid work. We work both with large corporates like Walmart, ING Bank, but also unicorns and startups with a single mission to help set up their workplace that is truly remote first, where employees' needs are simply met, and at the end of the day, everyone is happy because people are getting what they want, and company is getting happy, productive employees. So that's the mission, to empower everyone to have a freedom of choice where, when, and how they work. I'm today in Madrid, in Spain. We just spent last 2 months in Fuerteventura, in Canary Islands. Tomorrow going south of Spain, then we're going to Lisbon. So it's hard to say where we are based. Our last home was Austin in Texas, but I'm originally from Poland. Last 1.5 years we spent in Vietnam, in literally this home that I'm still homesick.
I was wondering whether you were actually in a field somewhere in South Asia, or had been
last year. That would have been true.
Okay, so I want to start with sort of with a question that I hope doesn't sound like we're sort of attacking the premise of the panel or sort of the premise, but this is part of the title of the panel is about how to make work beyond space and time. And the question is, does work actually exist beyond space and time? Should we think of it that way? Because I mean, I think there's a difference between being able to work anywhere or work according to a variety of different schedules, circadian rhythms, etc., versus the idea of work being something that, unlike the rest of our lives, kid pickup, dinner with family, etc., kind of exists in this, in this kind of Star Trek zone where time and space are utterly irrelevant. It feels to me like most of the work that I do actually happens in places, whether I want it or not, and it happens at times. But what's your take on this, and have the last 2 years taught us actually that we can finally escape the bounds of time and place when we work, and all work now just happens between our like our brains and our eyes and screens. Vita, how about you? You're on mute though.
Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
So I think
No,
that's a
cool.
really interesting question. I think the last 2 years have definitely taught us that this works. We're getting work done. I don't think that, there's debate on whether how well it works, I'm sure. And I think, people have opinions on that and stuff, but I think we can all say we can get work done. The interesting thing about that when we think about time is that it really has enabled us to work, across time zones, and we can collaborate in ways that we never thought or we could before. Does it exist beyond time? And I think this is where it gets interesting, and I would say sometimes a little bit dangerous as well, in terms of if it exists across time, it means that the boundaries have also expanded. For some, it may have been that, people were able to, they say that they're able to spend more time with their kids, or they're able to be more, I guess, present in their home life. But if you have somebody who's actually, you're collaborating with somebody who's 8 hours behind you or before you, you might actually be now working in times where, that would have been your time to take a break. And so I think the whole idea of working beyond space and time becomes really interesting. But I think what needs for it to be successful, I think people need to think about how companies can set the right expectations for their team members in order to support a team's well-being. And I think right now what we're seeing is that we've brought the in-company culture into virtual, which I think doesn't really work, because you actually need to define a whole new culture when you're virtual, or you have to define a component of your culture that fits into your company culture.
Okay, there are a couple things in there I want to follow up on, but Iwo, given you've been traveling a lot more than many of us have, are you being placeless, or are you being in lots of really cool different places?
Yes, so definitely a lot of different places, and oftentimes similar challenges. Number one, asynchronous versus synchronous communications. So to your point about the time when we're working and when we are, how we're communicating, this is actually probably one of the biggest shifts, besides the culture that has been mentioned, that the companies need to go through. Most of the communication that was happening in the office was very synchronous. You're talking, I'm responding in the office, right? And when March 2020 came, companies tried to replicate that. And that's why everyone was getting a lot of ad hoc messages, calls, etc., etc. Successful remote companies were communicating absolutely in a different way. They were from the day one implementing asynchronous communication. We are really thoughtful of how we're communicating. I'm not expecting you to answer immediately. There might be a SLA, service level agreement, that you're replying immediately if it's a huge issue, but this is determined by our internal communications policy, right? Not just the feeling of your manager that actually this task is very important, right? So looking at the big picture, to your point on the time, we need to redefine how we are communicating, and we need to move more towards asynchronous written communication that can be also video, but just like keeping this on one spectrum. So this is one aspect, and the other aspect, of course, we are still meeting, and we won't we won't erase meetings from our day-to-day operations. So, for instance, when we lived in Vietnam and most of our clients are in US or in Europe, waking up at 5:30 a.m. and then having calls with people that are still they still have time from their previous day is tricky, right? But it's tricky if you adjust your life that you're working in different hours. Then it becomes a totally different ball game, because it's no longer about 9 to 5. No, if you're an early bird, you can work from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. and then you can go surfing or play with your kids or go with your dog for the next couple of hours, right? So this is another shift. So number two, really redefining the time. And maybe last point that is also connected with this, when we are redefining the time, we need to also redefine what we look at as an outcome of our work. So far for last years, it was the 9 to 5, I'm present in the office, and then we're expecting that this person is working. It's absolutely something that is not going to last in future. So what we see, what is successful and how companies are doing this, is to productize the work. So really just not just say that, oh yes, we're focusing on outcomes. Yes, that's great, but this like very high level. But if you look at the single tasks that you're doing and single projects and single key results that you want to accomplish, this is really how we are moving towards defining products of our work rather the time. So if you combine all of these aspects, how we communicate, the time that we work, and what we actually produce, and how it's how companies see that, this is the biggest revolution that ever happened in the workplace. So it's very exciting, but it's also very dangerous, to Vita's point, and companies need to react and adjust to this new reality.
So I want to bring Steve in just a moment, but sort of I wanted to come back to Vita, because sort of the point you'd raised about sort of a need to set expectations around team well-being, sort of essentially finding way, sort of putting, I suppose, boundaries around the timelessness of work feels to me like some. Can you say a little bit more about sort of maybe how you guys do this at Girlboss, or of what you would like to do in this area that you think would make work better for you and your and team and company?
Yeah, I would love to share what we're doing at Girlboss. And I was able to actually see the transition from coming in my previous role where I actually worked partially during the pandemic, where we actually changed from in-office into fully remote because we had to. And then a lot of the processes that we were still doing at the time were actually things that we were used to when we were in office. Let's just set up meetings with everybody because your calendar is free. And, let's just work the hours that where everybody is available because we have these standard working hours. I think that, obviously that changed along the way. But when I started at Girlboss, because we all started remote and we're actually a remote first company, we don't have an in-office, it was just game changer for me. And I'm so proud of the team. And I'm so glad that I have a CEO who really cares about how we can work effectively in remote work. So, early on, first day of work, we already set the standards of asynchronous communication. If somebody reaches out to you on Slack, you are not expected to reply immediately. One of the things she also said that I really appreciated was that if somebody asks you for something last minute, that's their problem. If they needed it, they would come to you. They should come to you earlier, and that just alleviates so much stress from the team. Also, the third thing that's really important to us as well is transparency, right? If you need more time to do something, let's be transparent to the other person. Tell them that this is the situation I'm facing. I can't get this to you right now, or I can get this to you at whatever date. Are you okay with that? And if the person's not okay, obviously you have a communication about that. But we always know that things are always less urgent than they seem. Now, I think the most important part that I really love about Girlboss and how they've set or made asynchronous communication or work from home really effective is, number one, thinking about, do we need this meeting? Every meeting that I go into now internally has an intention, behind it. We have a goal, we have an objective, and we have a way to solve it. We set what the problem is, we give context behind what the problem is, and we bring our solution to the table. Now, if we need brainstorming, because that's obviously part of collaborative work, we come in with ideas. This not only ensures equity amongst teams when they're in a live brainstorming session, but this also ensures that the meeting runs more effectively. We share our ideas on a doc. We bold the things that we want to discuss because those are ideas we like, and we actually go into the brainstorm meeting with half of that already completed, and then we're just more effective because we're discussing the ideas that we already feel were the good ones that we potentially move forward with.
This is great. I mean, I think that the couple of big things I hear here, first of all, have to do with sort of a far greater degree of intentionality and sort of the articulation of formal norms around things like communications, about how you spend other people's time, and what demands you make on it, and and second, pushing back against kind of the defaults that our technologies sort of set for us, and saying that as organizations, we should create, we should not be bound to these, but we really need to make our own and figure out what is going to work for us. So I want to bring in Steve at this point, who is, and can you very briefly take a moment and just explain who you are and what you do and where you are?
Sure. So I'm Steve Chalgren. I'm a VP GM of specification program at Bluetooth. There's 3 programs at Bluetooth SIG, which you might not know what Bluetooth is. Bluetooth Special Interest Group actually holds all the IT globally for Bluetooth. And so anyone who wants to make a Bluetooth product needs to qualify their product with Bluetooth to gain access to the IP and the copyrights and the logo. And so we have 3 programs: the specification program, a promotion program, which is marketing, and a qualification program. That's how you people test their products. And my team has a large team that works with global RF engineers to create and release new Bluetooth technology.
Also, and is this group, I mean, this sounds like it's probably a pretty international group, or where are you guys located?
Mostly located in the Seattle area around Kirkland. However, we do have some people located around the world, different regions. But
okay.
Yeah.
And I'm curious sort of what your, can you say a word about how the last couple of years has changed how you and your team work? Like in January 2020, before everything kind of blew up, how are you working, and how does that compare to now?
Yeah, considering that we were globally a company working with global membership of 37,000 member companies, we were pretty much a butts and seat company, just from the tradition of engineering and standards. And so people were expected to come into the office 5 days a week. Oddly, I don't live in Seattle, I live in San Jose. So I was commuting up there every week and working really hard to get to a 3-day week up there. And I just accomplished that at the end of February, and the office closed the first week of March. So we went through a pretty big transition there. And to summarize it, we went fully remote. Ended up getting rid of 2 or 3 floors in our office building, remodeling the 1 floor that we have for full, just hoteling. There's really no one has an office, and everyone works from home, and they've sort of scattered a little bit across the Washington, Oregon area, and then we've been picking up new employees globally.
Vita, how about you and Girlboss? Sort of January 2020 versus today. Sort of how are you guys working differently?
Sorry, on mute again.
Yeah.
So I was actually at a different company
Oh,
prior
right.
to Girlboss. So where I was, 2020 was, back then, I was actually at a company where we were allowed to work from home once a week, but only between Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we were also able to work. We had to be in office between 10 to 4 as long as we work 8 hours. But back then when I said that to my peers, they're like, oh my gosh, wow, you're so lucky you get that one day and you can show up at the office at 10 but leave later. That's good to me because I can do my thing in the morning if I need to. So that was my quote unquote flexibility at work, and it was a huge perk back then. But I think a huge difference has really, like I said before, what I've noticed in the change between what has been the most effective for me was, not having somebody pull me aside at any given point in my workflow, and not just having meetings for the sake of, having a meeting or having a chat that doesn't actually come to any kind of solution at that, because it's so last minute or it's so immediate.
Right.
And not
Eva,
planned for.
Yeah, thank you. So Eva, we tend to talk about moving from office work to remote work, but has remote work itself changed in the last couple of years? Not just in terms of the number of people who are doing it, the percentage of folks who are or aren't, let's say, digital natives, but what are you seeing in remote work itself that has changed compared to 2 years ago?
Yes. So couple of years ago, I believe that was 3 years ago, when as Remote How we were organizing one of our summits, and there was a question on the panel, how much do we already know about remote work? And one of the panelists said that we are just starting, and that was 2019. So then a year later, the whole world started to learn how to do it. And I believe we're still figuring this out. There are a lot of best practices. Tools are improving. There is a ton of innovation happening. So there are already some best practices and ground rules. But because this is such a rapidly changing environment, let's meet in 2 years and see if what we think now is the way to go is actually what works really well. Before remote work went to mainstream, majority of teams that were operating this way, or majority of companies, were rather small. So the largest companies, Automatic, GitLab, still around 1,000 of employees, right? Of course, you had corporations that had distributed teams, but still the legacy of their behaviors of, like it was mentioned, meetings all the time, synchronous communication, etc., there was kind of on contrary to actually what these all remote companies that were defining how the work should be done, was actually happening. So I would say that what has changed in the last 2 years, for sure, technology is improving very fast. The adoption and understanding that this is the future and there's no way of going back. Then the impact on the culture and how we see that the culture should look like, that goes far beyond that we are remote or hybrid. No, this is just a totally different set of values. And before pandemic, the companies that were saying, Vita mentioned, transparency, trust, diversity, in many cases, there were just slogans and things that companies were putting on their career pages. But in the last 2 years, it was a moment, and we are checking the reality. And right now we are progressing with this check, and we're adjusting. And probably lastly, I mean, there are many things that change, but the impact that we see on our day-to-day lives outside of work, this is massive. And this is what people saw, that the life, many of us, and I'm a workaholic, so I can say it from my perspective as well, that life is not only about work. You can do other things as well that can drive joy in your life. And this is what we see, that companies are also trying to help their employees to incorporate this. So those are the things that are changing, both in the technology, how we are operating, but also how how we live. Although there is still a huge group of companies that would like to go back to February 2020, and we need to do everything possible to stop them.
We'll go back to that in a second, but Heatherly sort of sent a note that we have the results of the poll, and so let's have a look at these. So what shifted your, Heatherly, do you want to explain this, or should I read through it? Actually, if you can, that'd be great, because
Hi, yeah,
Yeah.
I can jump on,
Thank you.
and welcome, Steve. I'm so glad we got you in. I don't know what was up with the LinkedIn world or the Zoom world today. Yeah, so we had a part of you that are attendees take the poll, and so the first question we asked was kind of what shifts you made, right, from 2019 before the pandemic to the 2-year period of particularly restricted life with the pandemic. Not surprisingly, right, a good portion went from mostly office spaces to remote virtual. I think that's true for anyone who wasn't a frontline worker or had, their company had exceptions to some of the regulations in different countries. Some went from hybrid, so about 10% went from hybrid to remote. So you were already another big chunk, right? 29% were already remote, virtual, so no big deal. I'm one of those people. So how well did your company adequately support your team during the shifts made? Great to see 50% did a good job. But then I think, we have 38% that the companies perhaps were surprised. I certainly I'm sure the panel can talk about their own experiences of companies that were office first. The last 2 years of how do you make that big transition under constraints and successfully is of course part of our conversation. And then, is your company shifting its workspace policy this year? And I know, Alex, this is part of what you want to chat with the panel about, is now that we removed the constraints of the last 2 years, what do companies do? What do leaders do? What do people do now that our kind of mobility constraints are removed? So you see, let's see, we've got yes, 14% are moving to remote virtual first policy. A little bit are moving to hybrid flex. 14% are moving to an office first policy. And then we have undetermined, and then we have no changes planned yet.
All right. Well, thank you for that. That's, I think, I was impressed at how many percentage of people who felt well supported in these transitions. That's sort of not something I would have predicted, but this is exactly why we have surveys like this, so we can have our assumptions challenged. So as Heatherly had sort of said, one of the things I think that we want to sort of get into a little bit is the fact that there are some companies that are trying to kind of get everybody back into the office, or to go back to Pret, buy your sandwiches, for lunch, sort of support restaurants and sort of, et cetera. Others are kind of trying to craft various, either sort of couple days a week in sort of strategies, or they're just saying, sort of we are probably remote, except under, very specific circumstances for very certain kinds of sort of work that pops up. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, right? Is distributed work, as sort of the CEO of Twitter said, that distributed work is going to be much, much harder, right? And is it, sort of, I'm curious what your sense of this is, sort of, is distributed work going to be, or sort of work in general, thanks to sort of more people working distributedly, is this going to be harder for people, for managers in the near future? Or, is this, or is this something that more places should sort of embrace more enthusiastically? So, Steve, how about you? Since I see you're not on mute, or if I want to,
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's different doing remote work. So it's probably harder in some scenarios. You can't just walk down the hall and have a quick chat with someone. But then I think there's benefits, being able to, not having to chat with everyone while you're walking down the hall. And so I think I think it's a plus minus thing. And I think it also depends on the team, the type of work that they're doing and where they are in their process. If they're in the ideation stage, like Vita was talking about, that might be where you got to have these collaborations a little more complicated. But if you're in the work stage where everyone's just cranking out their product or what they're trying to do, maybe actually not being in the office is way more productive. So I think so you can mitigate both sides. You could have everyone work in the office and try to have super quiet areas for people to be able to concentrate, which is always hard in an office, especially an open office. And then if you're remote, you can create constructs around collaboration to make it work. So I think it goes either way. I think being remote has generally some better benefits, in that you can get more productivity, you have access to resources, you kind of relieves you of the construct of a full-time worker. You can just go hire people for particular jobs or part-time. People who might be unable to commute can now join the workforce. There's large pools of people who are having families and stuff and maybe not able to work full-time, and now they can hop in and have a 2-hour work week, 2-hour day job and provide huge value because they're super experienced, talented people. So I think all those things really open up for remote work that it's kind of hard to do in face-to-face kind of work.
Thanks.
Yeah. If I may add something and challenge a bit the ideation stage and in general the approach that we sometimes hear, there are hundreds of teams that are fully distributed and are successful in doing everything fully remote, meeting in person, of course, if it's needed, or if they just want to have fun, but in the offline world, right? But of course, what it requires a very, very in-depth knowledge, and then following certain processes. And so in general, it requires a change. It requires a change on a company level, on a manager level, team level, and then individuals. But it's not just that we have a magic wand and boom, the change happens. No, we need to cultivate the change, right? So one of the main reasons why companies are so hesitant is because they would need to change. And to Steve's points, then you won't be able to just walk and go to the room next to you. But actually, this is one of the things that frustrates you in the office, right? So you should be not doing this, and you should be also not replicating this when you're remote by like messaging someone on Slack, on Teams, and thinking that they will reply instantly, right? So people are afraid of change. We know that, and that goes beyond just work. But if we're looking at such a competitive talent market where companies are fighting super hard to find talent, then they're fighting super hard to keep people and to keep the retention high and keep people engaged and happy, there's no way of going back. So now we should rather focus on figuring how we should change how we are working rather than asking question if this is the way to go. And maybe last point, and I think that was mentioned by Lona on the previous panel, right now we need to ask people what they want. This is like a super simple question, right? And we will hear from people that they would like to come to the office because this is well they feel productive. We'll hear from people that they would like to work fully remote because this is they feel productive. And there will be also a mixed bag of other answers, but we need to personalize the experience. In the previous world, the experience was the same. Everyone was going to the same place in the same time, doing the same thing. Right now, we need to think how we can accommodate different needs, different expectations, and this is simply hard. It's more work and more change. So that would be my 2 cents.
Vita, anything to add?
No, I think it was well covered. I just want to tie some of these points together because, what I think as, when I was thinking about what is it about that remote work is really hard. And I think part of that is that leaders and managers really need to put their people first more than ever before, right? And that comes back to Iwo's point of, everybody wants something different in this era that I don't want to say it's era, it's probably here to stay for some time, but in this time of remote work is that, we are going to have those people who really need that in-office experience. Maybe their home life just doesn't really accommodate for work from home, or their working style is just being outside of there, whatever that may be. And so in order for distributed work to work, I think distributed work already works because we've proven it. I think what's going to be the challenge is how do we support distributed work that is successful and is, productive, but also puts the well-being of the teams first. And leaders and managers really need to, really listen to their team's needs in order to make that successful. Now, the second thing is, like, when I was thinking about on Steve's point, like, going back to the office, maybe you have something that you need to be in person. I mean, I think there are rare occurrences where that might happen, but say you really need to. I think what frustrates people the most when it comes to in office is not necessarily the fact that, they have to, I mean, part of it is that the commute probably sucks. Part of it is that they, have they're spending money on lunch or whatever that may be. But I think a huge part of it is actually that, back to the point of intention, is that there's no intention when you're in office. If I was asked to go in office and I personally left that office feeling like, okay, I got something out of this in terms of my work, in terms of the team's growth, I think I'd be okay with that. But it was that everything was just, because we're here, so we have to do it this way. That needs to be changed.
Okay, so this is the big question, I think, which is, what should offices be? What should we use offices for, right? They're sort of, I think, far too many of them 2 years ago were essentially open plan distraction amplifiers and warehouses for, for bodies, without a lot of thought about what we can get from having people actually congregate physically together. This is a question that I think we've got to ask now, right? If you're going to, if you're going to ask people to assume the cost in time and money of coming into work, what kind of work do you ask them to do when they're there? What do you have to do to the space in order to make it worth coming to?
Yeah.
Now answer. Go for it, Iwo.
So I can maybe add some points. So there are a couple of potential areas what the office could be used for. So first one is team engagement, bonding, and just simply hanging out together. One of the best examples is what Dropbox did. Dropbox basically completely changed their office, and one of the main purposes right now is just, this is the place where people come and hang out together, right? It's no longer about working, it's about just spending time together. And how you're spending this time together, it can be a workshop, you can ideate on the new product, but this is their choice. They met together and they're doing this, right? So companies need to really, really, really understand why and what should be done in this in this office when it comes to work. And we would probably see things around workshops, brainstorming, this kind of collaborative things. They are totally possible remotely to be done successful, and it's a bit tricky. So some companies are like, okay, it will be easier if we just have everyone in the office. But as for the transition phase, it's fine. And then the second point, what I mentioned, it will be the place where people are meeting, getting to know each other, and just having fun. Prior to pandemic, the time for fun was mainly during the Christmas party or some team retreats, but that was very occasional. Right now, for people that would like to get this time together, they can get it, and they should get it in the office, but it shouldn't be only connected with work. And maybe last thing to keep in mind here is that people have different expectations. There are introverts, there are extroverts, and that's why there won't be the same definition for everyone for this time in the office. So we can most certainly say that the offices will stay. because there were some articles in 2020 that bye-bye offices. No, they will stay because there are still some people that enjoy spending some time there. But they need to be completely redefined, and we cannot force people to go in there. Just yesterday we had a conversation. I cannot say the name of the company, but giant corporations, thousands of people all over the world, and the HR business partner saying, you know, we have this problem because we introduced the policy 3 days the office, 2 days remote, but people are not happy. What we can do about it? But and I'm asking, okay, like what were your business metrics in the last 2 years? Did everything collapse? No, everything was amazing. We had the best financial years ever in the history. Like, so what is the problem? Like, everyone needs to go back, and there's this artificial number of days that you need to spend in the office to do the same, exactly the same work that you've been doing at home, right? I'm like, you have a problem, but we are here to help.
Yeah, I think it's. I think maybe now the office, after being remote for a few years, is sort of like a technology looking for a solution rather than having a problem and then the office is the answer. In our transition, now that we can go to the office at Bluetooth, at the E-staff level, we're like, okay, why are we going to use the office? That's the question, right? So we're like, we have this thing. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to do team building? Maybe new employees, don't, need some help. They can meet people and kind of form some relationships to do mentoring offline and stuff like that. But it is really along those questions that, and it's not clear exactly when we should have people in the office. So different teams are sort of experimenting, when, hey, maybe we should go meet in the office and have lunch together. Okay, let's try it. It's kind of like that right now for us. And some people don't want to come in. And so there was actually a significant conversation around, should in-office meetings be mandatory? And that was initially the thrust of kind of some people from before, with the button seats mentality. And then it's softened to be, well, no, I guess any in-office meeting would also be hybrid. And so then we actually purchased some equipment to enable that, and then actually had conversations with managers around, how do you properly manage a hybrid meeting? Because it does take more energy from the host to make sure that you're sucking in those people that are not in person.
Steve, are you seeing any sort of predictable generational differences in who prefers being all remote versus sort of in the office versus having some mix? Because I can imagine that, if I've got 2 kids in a minivan, I've been doing this stuff for like 15 years. I can do this in my sleep now. I can do it at home just as easily as if I'm in the office. But I can also imagine being like 22 and thinking, I can work absolutely anywhere. So, but what are you seeing in terms of who has these and expresses these preferences?
Well, there's certainly muscle memory. So there's definitely people that, like really were used to the routine of going into the office and like that. But then after that, it kind of falls apart. There's people that are, just like Iwo, I think is that, is extroverts, introverts. So extroverts want to go in, doesn't matter what demographic or age they're in. Introverts kind of like being home. And then there's people that are just starting off, need help, kind of figuring out like, how do I even do my job? They want more collaboration in person. So it's kind of different based on where everyone is in their life and their personality.
It feels to me like this is something that I would love to get a better handle on. Is right? Is like psychology a bigger driver than demographics or something else? But I just don't have a clear picture of that yet. I'm going to be handing things over to Heatherly in sort of a moment. Thank you for sort of popping back up. But the other, one of the other questions I wanted to sort of get your reactions to is, we've been talking about psychological preferences, sort of referring to the fact that there are some people who are like more night owls versus early birds, et cetera. And so my question is, how much of talking about making work independent of time and space is about catering to personal preferences versus, or, making people responsible for solving the problems that hybrid work creates, versus option 3, which is taking a more organization first approach and thinking in terms of sort of better structures and better processes that serve everyone, right? Is this like work-life balance 2 years ago, where you had to figure it out for yourself, or, and this was not something that you solved like collectively or through like better policy? Or is this something that that companies themselves have got to take the lead on?
Yeah, I can start.
Sure, go ahead.
So absolutely on the company level,
Okay.
and absolutely on the individual level. Like, it needs to go hand in hand, because on one side, the company needs to set the tone, needs to help define processes, and needs to define expectations. But then it's up to us as individual contributors is how we're delivering this and how we're also managing ourselves. What remote work does is that you need to now, or you are already for the last 2 years or maybe more, a manager of yourself. There's no longer someone sitting 2 desks behind you and looking at your screen. Right now, you have something that needs to be done, and it's up to you, right? If you won't be delivering, then you're giving an excuse to your manager to micromanage you and just like ask, hey, how is it going? How is the deadline? Right? So the more you're becoming independent and the more you're showing that you can manage yourself, the better. And then from the company perspective is that once the process is defined, or you're helping to define it, then you're following the process, but then you're also giving feedback on improving this, right? One of the things that companies that were remote before pandemic were doing, were building playbooks on how we are working. And part of the playbook is basically we're documenting our work. It's pretty common for product teams, but then if you look at other types of work, it's not that common. And this is one of the areas where it needs to be company guidance with the individual contributor support, while everyone is open for honest feedback and on improving things, because there is no process that cannot be adjusted and redefined. So we need to be open that if we define something on Monday next week, then probably in 3 months it will be totally different, and it's fine, and it's actually better because we just had some assumptions. So it's a mix, but what we see is necessary to make this happen is the owner of the change. That's why companies like Facebook, Quora, because of pandemic, or GitLab before pandemic, hired people that are head of remote, head of workplace. There are different fancy names, but basically the main responsibility of this person is to make sure that these changes really happen, and there's an adoption within the company of such change, and there's also a support. So this is one of the actionable items to ask yourself: is there an owner of the change? Because the worst thing that can happen is that it's happening, but no one is actually really managing this.
This is, I could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, I or my dog actually has a vet appointment that I need to get to. So I'm gonna let Heatherly take control from here on. You're in good hands. Thank you all, Vita, Ivo, Steve, thank you very much. And thanks to the crowd. And so enjoy the rest of the session.
Great.
Thank
you,
so much,
Alex. I hope his dog is okay. It's a bit of a semi-emergency. He needs to get his dog in today. And this was the time slot. So there we go. One of the benefits of being remote virtual worker. He can grab his dog from his workplace and go. Yeah, we have one question, which we'll get to in a minute. I would love to, before we get to that question, have one more question for you guys for you to talk about. Because I myself personally, and Steve and I go way back, and he knows that I've been virtual pretty much since I think 1995 or 6, maybe was the last time I was 5 days in an office. And honestly, I can't think of a situation. I really cannot think of a situation or an offer that would get me personally back into an office 5 days a week. So I'd be curious for any of you, what would it take? What can you conceive of a situation where you personally would go back into the office the vast majority of the work time? Eva's like, no.
I could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's doable. It's it has to be a pretty awesome, super crazy opportunity, something I'm really excited to do. And there's a pretty high bar on commutability and stuff like that. So if I could bike to work or walk to work or things like that where it's not really painful. And then the opportunity could. I mean, I really, really enjoy remote work, and I've done it from on and off for years. But I could go either way if the proper opportunity was there.
Right, with the right requirements. Vita, what about you?
Certainly no. The only thing I could actually think of that could get me in the office 5 days a week was if you offer me something like a bizarre amount of compensation, but I'm thinking, out of the world kind of thing, then that's the only reason. That will be the only scenario I would be able to accept, I think. But of course, with that being said, it also needs to be, an opportunity that's also amazing alongside other things. So I'm asking for a lot in order to get that.
Well, and I asked that question. So I actually asked that question because it's kind of a fun question, and it's kind of a thought process question, but also because it does lead to, I think, both kind of both of the open questions we had from the audience, as well as this broader idea of I think, Ivo, you talked about personalization. Or the need to recognize, I think all of you talked about the need to recognize the diversity of the workforce and the needs of the workforce, right? Whether it's neurodiversity, certainly underrepresented groups, gender, various situations that we know from a lot of published studies now that solely in office, because we've had so many decades of experience of solely in office experience, that there's been a lot of aggression, microaggressions, and abuse and inequities, right, across these types of diverse populations of teams that we should want diversity because it strengthens our products and services, it strengthens our companies. So we know from decades of research that now that we're able to be more transparent about this, that in office has done in a way that's been done in the past without a lot of thought, encourages these inequities, right? So thinking about going hybrid and flex, now that we're moving into I think a more enlightened corporate idea that remote and hybrid can work, what are your thoughts? And that's kind of how we'll wrap it up, because I think it addresses these questions. Like, what programs or actions are top of mind to you that we can bring into the hybrid and flex environment to make sure we don't reproduce those inequalities of what we saw in office first? What would be the top one thing that you're like, we need to have this program or this awareness or this action so that we don't bring before 2020s, inequalities in the office space into the remote and flex work area?
Yep. My answer would be short. Everything that we're doing needs to be remote first. It doesn't matter if it's remote, hybrid, flex, however you want to call it. The principle is about remote first, and it's about all these best practices that we also talked about today, like asynchronous communication, but those are the things that needs to really exist, needs to be followed, and that would create an equal playing field. Because one of the worst things that can happen, especially if we're talking about hybrid, where we have a mix of different places, locations, and times, is that we're actually creating an unequal workplace, and this is a very serious risk. So everything what's happening needs to create an equal playing field when it's about remote first. Doesn't matter where you are. And to Steve's points, for example, when you're hosting a hybrid meeting, one of the best practices is that everyone should be actually taking this meeting on their separate laptop. So we shouldn't be using conference rooms. I mean, you can, but it just simply makes things harder. And then the loudest person in the room still takes over, etc., etc. So remote first principles, looking at different areas of how you're working. And that would be a general approach, but then you can divide it into different small programs and initiatives that are supporting this.
I think just on the whole situation you described, Heatherly, I think maybe really some more training for managers and for employees to really understand all the different ways people communicate. Text can be misread very easily. There's no smiley faces in text, and so someone could misread it, misunderstand it. And so you got to be really, really clear on how you write and how you communicate. And I think some of that might be training. And then, of course, if you're remote, make sure that there's a way for a person to contact HR more seamlessly. They can't just walk down the hall. So how do they communicate in a trusting way with HR and any kind of issues come up? But maybe I saw the note prioritizing empathy from Nina. I think that's right on. Maybe that's part of the training. Really focus on that, especially considering the remoteness of everything.
I think the last point that I would like to add to this as well is that we're talking about how to make remote work equitable. And I think it really starts from were we even equitable to begin with before that, right? So thinking about our people, and I see a question or somebody asking here, distribution center versus the office, or are people in the office getting more perks than people in the distribution center because maybe they're paid differently? I think at the very core, if you're not already giving an equal level playing field and giving them people, the compensation and the benefits that they need, it's really hard for you to add in a program to say, I'm equitable, I care about diversity and inclusion and all of that, because they're not even getting the basic benefits of what they deserve, or of that. So looking at your hiring practices, looking at your compensation benefits, are you treating everybody equally in terms of, or giving everybody the same, equal perks across all teams, and what does that look like? I think that at the very core needs to be fixed too, because there's a lot of conversations surrounding that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think this is, we probably have more questions than answers sometimes. Obviously conscious culture, we are committed to working with companies and leaders of companies who really want to work on these topics, right? How to make work better for all their people, and that therefore improves their business outcomes. And we've had a lot of discussions, yesterday in our sessions, we talked about things like reduced work structures, right? Like 32-hour work weeks or 5 short days or things like that. And, one of the, I think to your point, Vita, and to all of you, one of the things that we, those panelists came away with, which is understand the whys, the problems you need to solve as a company, right? Equity should be a very high why. Understand the why, understand your needs and requirements. And then for your, one of the things that those panelists talked about, for example, in the reduced work structures at time is then certainly look to examples of other companies, but also understand your uniqueness, your industry. So if you do have distribution centers and office, if you do have frontline and virtual, or knowledge workers that can be virtual, for example, to your point, be aware of this and the hyper personalization, and that equity is not necessarily, I think we have to be very careful. Equity is not necessarily means the same, right? That's the hyper personalization aspect. So as a company, we need to, I would say to Vicky and others who have those questions, you need to have these open conversations with your employees and find a way to make the experience equitable for the people who must be in the office and the people who are remote. And it can go both ways, Vita. I think, the remote people could have more benefit in some ways, right? They're more free to pick up their kids and take their dog to the vet. And so you need to address those. And I think with open conversation, transparency, this has been a fabulous panel.